Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Hey there, this is Joe Fish, the lead producer at The Big Story, and I am sitting here for our I guess sort of, bi-monthly feedback episode. We do it whenever there's a long weekend, but either way, I'm sitting here with our host, Jordan Heath Rawlings. Hello, Jordan. How you doing?
Hello. You sighed before you started that. You were like, I'm Joe Fish. It's been a long week for Joe.
Yeah, I wasn't sighing about doing this. Maybe it's just, I don't know, it's October.
It's getting gray and rainy.
It sucks, October. I don't know. How do you feel about it?
I mean, Halloween's coming. Don't we like Halloween?
I guess. I don't have any kids, so Halloween for me just means vandalism, I guess.
Vandalism? Parties?
Yeah, I guess that's true. No, there are things on the horizon to look forward to.
So I hope so.
Yeah. Okay.
After that preamble, let's go. Hit me with some feedback.
After that depressing preamble. Yeah, let's dive right into the feedback. So we just got this piece recently that we both thought was pretty interesting. It's about our affiliation with Rogers. So here it is. Hey, Jordan, I've been listening to your podcast for a while now and noticing all the connections to Rogers lately. Don't remember seeing that months back. Is that new? That Rogers owns your podcast, or how does that work?
It's not new. Rogers has always owned this podcast. We developed this podcast here at Rogers. We all work for Rogers, and I assume that you're saying it's new because at the end of the credits that I do once a week, I've started to say a division of Rogers. And the only reason I started doing that is because a couple people asked when we covered issues around competition or when we covered the telecom industry, and they say, aren't you guys owned by Rogers? And I figured might as well just do it as a blanket statement so it's very clear and transparent for our audience. But nothing has changed. We're still owned by the same people we've always been owned by, and they still pay me every 2 weeks.
Okay, well, that begs the obvious question. How does the affiliation with Rogers influence the show?
I mean, the really short answer is that it doesn't. We're probably way too small for Rogers to notice and monitor, but nobody here. I mean, we work with City News. We have a totally independent editorial structure. The only thing that we've ever been asked to do and are required to do is when, for instance, we cover something that involves Rogers, we would then say Rogers, which owns Frequency Podcast Network and The Big Story. The same way that if you follow baseball at all and read about the Blue Jays on sportsnet.ca, when they mention Sportsnet, they will always say Rogers, which also owns Sportsnet as well as the Blue Jays. And it is just in the interests of full disclosure. I just decided to start being proactive about it.
Let's move on to a little bit more inside baseball. We're going to talk about In This Economy, the other show on Frequency that you're the host of. We've been toying around on In This Economy, not we, I don't personally work on the show, but you've been toying around on In This Economy with a sort of new, I would say truncated, quick hit format. And we wanted listener responses to that new format. We wanted to know how people felt about it. I would say the responses were pretty much overwhelmingly positive, but let me read one here. Hi, you asked for feedback. I think the concept and format is fine, but your guest expert should be an economist or at least someone with greater expertise. I like the relatable questions from you. For example, your comment about a fixed or variable mortgage. Presumably, many listeners would like those pros and cons discussed more fully. I just didn't feel your guest provided much more than basic knowledge of the economy.
There are worse things than providing basic knowledge of the economy, but
That's true.
I do take your point. And what we've trying to do with this show, and the response was overwhelmingly positive, which is amazing. What we're trying to do with this show is give you a very quick recap and actionable information based on economic events in the news. So sometimes that will be with an economist, as you've probably seen since then. Sometimes it'll be with a car expert. Sometimes it'll be with an expert in insolvency or mortgages. And it'll change week to week. And we'd always like to hear your feedback on our guests, but also my job as a host about the direction of the show in general. I think the thing that I was most gratified about was we asked for feedback and people gave it to us. And that is so key when you're molding a show that's still pretty new. So thank you to everybody who wrote in.
Okay, so safe to say that listeners are going to see more of this type of content in the ITE feed?
Yeah, we're going to be doing it just about every week at the same time as we are working on a new season of In This Economy, featuring some different kinds of episodes. But in the meantime, These episodes are intended to help our listeners keep up with the incredibly fast-paced economy that we're dealing with these days, especially at a time when so many people are right up close to the edge, and that's what we want to try to help with.
Okay, fair enough. Let's maybe move on here from messages about, I would say, the sort of the form of the show to messages or feedback about the content of the show. So we recently did an episode with food writer Corey Mintz. It was about tip creep. It actually wasn't the first time Corey was on the show covering that subject, but it was a great episode. I thought Corey did a great job of sort of giving us the history of tipping and sort of telling us why, by many of our estimations, it's kind of gotten so out of control. But we asked listeners to write in with examples from their own lives of times that they thought that tip creep kind of reared its ugly head, and maybe they were egregiously asked to leave a gratuity somewhere. And we got one that I thought was pretty good from Enrico.
This is the best one. We heard a few on social media. This is the best one, and it tops all the examples that we came up with internally when we were talking about this episode. So go ahead.
Hello, just listened to the latest episode on tip creep, and I had to share my most egregious tip prompt story. This past summer, I went to La Ronde Amusement Park with my nephew and niece, and they wanted a slush drink. So I found a vendor with slush machines where you serve yourself. The kids loved it because you can mix and match flavors. I went to pay for the already overpriced drinks. The employee handed me 2 empty cups, turned the iPad around, and there it was. A tip prompt for empty cups that my niece and nephew filled themselves from a machine. Needless to say, I have never hit the no tip option faster and felt no guilt.
It's truly amazing to hear that in the wild. I have heard anecdotes, and I have no way to verify them or not, about people occasionally getting a tip prompt on like a self-checkout.
Yep.
This is in that vein, and it is just, listen, I'm sorry to slushy guy, but you can't try to pull that off.
No, it's pretty incredible. And I mean, this episode did spark some pretty interesting discussions internally with the team about where we tip and where we don't tip. And what kind of struck me is just how dependent it is just on your own personal preferences or your own feeling towards things. There really is no roadmap anymore. Like, some people tip on this, some people don't. I said I rarely tip on Uber rides. I think that's just because when Uber started, there was no tips, and I've become used to it. Other people on the team said they always tip on Uber rides. I don't know. It's truly the Wild West.
I feel like years ago, before the pandemic, before tip creep really started, everybody kind of understood what you would tip for. You would tip for drinks at bars. You would tip for sit-down service in a restaurant. You would maybe tip the valet who parked your car or the guy who brought your suitcase to your room. And, it was kind of clearly delineated. But now that you're being asked to tip for almost everything, everybody's got to find their own comfort zone. And I do think discussing that with other people is fascinating.
You know what? I think what really bugs people about this is I think it's mostly about choice. I think people resent the sort of social pressure, the kind of impersonality of an electronic terminal prompting you to tip. You know what I mean? Like, it kind of takes the sort of human element away, and I think sort of undercuts the sort of basic idea of a tip, which is like an appreciation of a service being provided. And I don't know. It's really interesting times. I thought that was a cool episode.
I used to work at Starbucks when I was in university. And I feel like that's a really good example because on the one hand, Starbucks is a big, huge, faceless corporation, but it's staffed a ton by workers who are, putting themselves through school or supporting a family or whatever. And this was way before the days. I mean, we had debit machines, but they didn't have prompts on them. Most people paid for their coffee in cash. And people had no problem, dropping an extra 50 cents or $1 in there. I think that once you move to that prompt, then you're all of a sudden asking people to confront whether or not they actually will tip in this situation. Whereas previously it was like you just throw in whatever you have back from the $3.30 your coffee cost, right? And now you're like, well, 10% on that is like 49 cents. Do I want to tip 49 cents or should I round it up to $1? And you get all sorts of complicated mental gymnastics to try to figure out what used to be keep the change.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting to think about how much of this is about how the interaction has shifted in the digital age. Part of me thinks it might be more about that than the actual amount or tip creep. Maybe not more, but I don't know. Food for thought.
And as Corey said, and I think is the most key thing from the whole conversation, is you need to know where your tips are going when you're tipping in a situation like that, right? Like, places do not generally post where their tips go. And if we made everybody do that, and I could read like, these tips will all go directly to Starbucks workers and nobody's going to skim off the top or whatever, then fine. Anyway, it's a fascinating discussion.
All right, let's round off this feedback episode with one that when we were recording, I kind of had a feeling would touch a nerve, and then lo and behold, it totally did.
It was supposed to touch a nerve.
It was okay. Yeah, it was deliberately, what's the word I'm looking for? Inflammatory. Not really. But we recorded an episode with Matt Gurney about the Ontario government's decision to allow convenience stores throughout the province to sell booze, essentially. There was also some, well-deserved controversy surrounding the plan. But you and Matt kind of had an interesting sort of like, I would say more laid back. Irreverent discussion about sort of the reactions to it. And some people in the province didn't really care for your tone. So I'll do one piece of written feedback and one piece of recorded feedback that I really liked here. The first one comes to us from Matt. And I'm heavily truncating this. It was a long piece of feedback, but I edited it somewhat. So I might fall into the category of the outraged, but I think I'm like most, and we are frustrated that our leaders don't seem to have a unified plan, and often they are not representing the will of the people. Or if they are, it's a minority of us. Hundreds of millions spent on moving up this booze distribution plan could have been put towards more pressing priorities. An anecdote to share. My wife works at an addictions facility here in Oshawa, and of the clients that come through, 75% of them are trying to get off alcohol, not opioids or fentanyl. It's one of the more destructive addictions, and its withdrawal symptoms are on a level near that of heroin, something that surprised me to learn. Does making booze more available mean we'll see more people in the rehab facility? Maybe not, but I don't think it's going to help. And I don't think the majority were asking for booze at Circle K at 7 a.m. over something more valuable to the community.
I don't disagree with any of that. And I don't think Matt does either. And I think we even touched on most of that in the conversation, maybe just not right off the top, and maybe not with as much frustration and anger as this listener would like. And that was kind of by design, because sometimes in Toronto, in Ontario, you just need to laugh at the way a government handles something, or else you'll spend all your time either being outraged or crying. And I think all the points that listener Matt raised are totally valid, and I agree with them, but sometimes this province is ridiculous. And again, we could do a very serious episode on Doug Ford's plan to dig a tunnel under Highway 401, or we could treat it the way it deserves to be treated.
Right. Okay, I don't want to pile on here, but we did receive a voicemail from a listener who lives in rural Ontario that also took exception to the sort of tenor of your discussion with Matt. And I just want to play 1 minute of it. It's quite a long voicemail because they were animated, and there was a lot of good stuff in there. So thank you for sending it. But here's just like the sort of a minute long snippet or so.
So when you guys are making a joke about all us progressives with their knickers in a bunch, I actually don't care what people do in their free time. If people want to drink, I'm actually kind of for safe supply, legalize sex work. I'm a pretty all holds barred person. My anger isn't about people purchasing alcohol. It's about the priorities of this government. It's about not being able to afford to live here. And in a typical kind of Toronto type, not to play into the cliche, but you guys are all laughing while the rest of us are just like, wow, there goes a good paying job, because I have a feeling that you're pretty comfortable in your lives. So the next time you want to make your listeners, like me, a punchline, you might want to actually maybe talk to a few of us so you can realize it's not that, we're not these like trite, like, oh, I hate Doug Ford, so I'm just get mad at anything he does. I mean, don't get me wrong, I hate Doug Ford and I get mad at pretty much everything he does. But it's an issue of priorities and what we're privileging and what we're not, and who's getting served in this province and who isn't.
She called you out pretty hard for being sort of, Toronto-centric and kind of flippant about the concerns of more rural Ontarians there.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not wrong, but it's not the intention of that episode. And maybe we should have been a little more clear up front that, like, Matt is here to have some fun with me. This is a Friday episode. It's intended to be a bit of a lighthearted discussion about why Ontario does. And listen, regardless of your feelings on Doug Ford or progressivism or anything else, Ontario does sometimes tend to get its knickers in a bunch, which is a great phrase, by the way. So kudos to the listener for using that one. But like I said, the intention of that was to have fun with a topic that I think a lot of people have been having fun with. And I would hope that all our regular listeners have seen us relentlessly cover this government and its priorities as we do other governments and their priorities. We invested a whole lot of time and effort into making a gigantic mini-series about the Greenbelt scandal. Friends that I have from outside the province sometimes complain about how often we hammer Ontario's government for one ridiculous thing or the other. So listen, I don't want to make anybody feel neglected. I don't want to make any listener feel like we don't want to hear from them, because that's why we do these episodes. But I also, that's not why we do these episodes. We do them, like I said, sometimes because you got to have fun or everything is just relentlessly miserable. And let me tell you, it is hard to find a fun news story these days. I don't know if you looked around, but it's really tough.
Yeah, no, it's not easy. I think that reaches the end of our sort of feedback bag that we wanted to cover today, Jordan. Any final thoughts for those listeners out there in the world?
I really appreciate this feedback, even when it is totally negative about how we handled something, because we like to try things out, as evidenced with the new format for In This Economy. We like to try things out and get feedback. And as evidenced by the feedback from the alcohol in convenience stores episode, we are also totally open to that feedback when it's negative. And all of that helps the show get better and helps me get better. So as I always say, like literally a huge, sincere thank you to everybody who takes the time.
And there you have it. Please keep writing in, even if we didn't feature your feedback on today's episode. Please rest assured, we are reading it, we are listening to it, we are taking it to heart, and please keep it coming. And maybe next time it will be your voice featured on the show. My name is Joe Fish. I've been sitting here with Jordan Heath Rawlings. And thank you very much for tuning in here. And we will be back with you tomorrow with a fresh big story.